So I'm on Twitter. Many of you, I'm sure, are also on Twitter. Many of you are probably not on Twitter, and I'm starting to envy those of you who are not. I had placed an announcement on Twitter I received from Lexham Press, the publisher of the Abridgment, the cover art for the book. And so I thought, well, this is a good opportunity for me to tweet this out, and it'll be very good, and my mother will like it. And so I did, and I referenced Tocqueville in my tweet. And there were several gracious people, who retweeted it and liked it and so forth and so on. And I received, as you sometimes do, I received a reply from someone I did not know, had never met, and had a name that was a mystery to me. Not a human name, kind of like Dog Lover, @DogLover4, something like that. And the person said, just wanted to correct you. It's de Tocqueville, not Tocqueville. Hashtag spell check. And I just thought, well, okay, that's Twitter for you, and just moved on. But then as I thought about it, in his insistence that I include the preposition de, which of course is French for of, this attempt at correction just sort of characterizes something that Tocqueville observed about Americans when he was here in 1831, and that is that Americans have trouble understanding and appreciating aristocracy, and they don't know how to render an aristocratic title because, of course, as you know, Tocqueville is not his name. Tocqueville is his title. Tocqueville is a region of France up in Normandy, and of course he's from an aristocratic family. So in the book by George Wilson Pearson, who wrote Tocqueville in America in 1938, it's a great book. It's you can go on Amazon and get a recent reprint. This book is excellent because if you want a thorough treatment of Tocqueville's journey in America, that was a 10-month journey, Pearson gave almost a day-by-day analysis of his journey. And so I highly recommend his book. There's a recent reprint of it. But Pearson, I read just a few days after this tweet, man, Pearson vindicated me because he said that Americans always feel the need to put the de in front of Tocqueville. And he said the de is like a red flag indicating that a French word is coming because Americans find Tocqueville very foreign and they need something in front of it. So I thought about tweeting that out to that guy, to Dog Lover 4, whatever his name was, but I refrained from that. And my mother was proud of me for my restraint. But this lecture is entitled How to Read Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And, of course, the book comes out in 1840 in its entirety and has been a classic ever since. It's been read and enjoyed by Americans, by French, by English-speaking people. It's been read most recently since the fall of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. It's been read and devoured by people in Eastern Europe who are coming out of generations of communism. And so it's the most important work on American political institutions, American culture, American society, probably ever written. Historians are pretty much in agreement on that. It's widely quoted, especially around election season times. Ronald Reagan was fond of quoting Tocqueville, for example. But you've probably noticed that very few people have actually read the book, which is interesting. The title, Democracy in America, suggests something very intuitive. We're Americans. We all know we live in a democracy. We have all likely participated in our democracy from time to time in various ways. And so we think of a title like Democracy in America as being a very intuitive thing. We pick it up, we start reading it. Many Americans find it very long, the style very plodding, very foreign in its concepts, and put it down. Plus, let's just be honest. This is a long book. This is my unabridged version, the Phillips Bradley edition, and it's pushing over 1,000 pages. So, it is a long book. It's a tough slog sometimes, but every American citizen should read it. Every American citizen should read it. Because it's like looking into a mirror for those of us who are Americans. But we don't read Democracy in America like we would read just any book, after all, because Democracy in America is actually two kinds of books. For one, it's a historical artifact. It's written, Volume 1 is written in 1835, Volume 2 is written in 1840. It's based on a 10-month journey that Tocqueville takes through the United States and Jacksonian America in the early 1830s. So it's a window on a particular moment in American history. So it is a historical artifact. And so we have to think historically when we read Democracy in America. But it's also a work of political science and sociology. And so there's a great deal that's pertinent to American institutional, political, social, economic life today. So when we read Tocqueville, we have to have a particular method as we read it. And so that's the purpose of the lecture today. As we read, we consider 4 contextual elements. First, who Alexis de Tocqueville was. Second, why he came to America. Third, what America was like when he came to America. And last, how the book was received and why is it important for us today. In short, how do we read Tocqueville? In short, when we take into consideration the context in which the book is written, then we can begin to appreciate the meaning and the relevance of this classic work. So who was Alexis de Tocqueville? Well, he's born in 1805. He dies in 1859. He's born into an ancient aristocratic family that traces its heritage back 9 generations or more. One of the things they were very proud of was that one of their relatives fought at the Battle of Hastings in 1066 under William the Conqueror, when William the Conqueror conquered England and defeated the English under King Harold in 1066 at Hastings. But his relatives, his elder relatives, suffered greatly during the French Revolution. His great-grandfather was guillotined, but not before he was forced to watch, his daughter guillotined. So his great-grandfather, his aunt, and several other relatives in the family suffered execution during the Revolution. His parents, his father, his mother, were themselves imprisoned during the Terror and were themselves awaiting execution, but were rescued by the arrest and subsequent beheading of Maximilien de Robespierre, who was, of course, the instigator of all this. And so they were released after the death of Robespierre. But his mother was shattered by the experience, as you can imagine. And she was never the same. So they suffered greatly under the Revolution. That experience never really left the family. It was always something of a dark shadow, as it were, hanging over the family. Now, young Alexis was educated by a tutor as a young child in the traditional and Orthodox Catholic way of the French aristocracy of the day. But as a teenager, he discovered his father's ample library, and he began reading works by Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Montesquieu and Voltaire and Pascal and many of the other great philosophers of the late medieval and Enlightenment period. He did not break from his belief in God, but he did break from his Orthodox Catholicism. Tocqueville remained a committed theist for the rest of his life. He had a strong belief in the existence of God, had a strong belief in God's providence, but he was no longer an Orthodox Catholic as an adult. He entered law school. He graduated and became a juge auditeur, which is an apprentice judge of the day in 1827, and served at the royal court of the Bourbon Restoration under Charles X at Versailles. And he met his travel companion, who came with him to America in 1831, Gustave de Beaumont, while at Versailles. That brings us to the question, why did he come to America? Why did he want to come to America? Well, Tocqueville served, of course, under Charles X. Charles X was the Restoration Bourbon monarch that came to the throne after the defeat of Napoleon in 1815. And so he serves under Charles X as a judge. And Charles X is overthrown in the July Revolution of 1830. And as you probably know, Eugène Delacroix painted this painting, this very famous painting, Liberty Leading the People, to commemorate the July Revolution of 1830. In the July Revolution, Charles X, the last of the Bourbon monarchs, is overthrown by Louis Philippe, who is actually his cousin. I have a cousin like that. And so immediately after the revolution is over with, all public officials are forced to, take a public oath, take an oath of loyalty, which of course Tocqueville does. He's very reluctant to do so, but it's necessary for him to do so. So he takes the oath. But he's in a total catch-22 here, because his family, his mother and his extended family, they're all loyal to the Bourbons still. And so Louis Philippe and the new reigning monarch, his new administration, they're coming in, and they all know that where his family's loyalties lie. So he wasn't afraid for his life, but he was worried about his prospects for his career. And we can understand that. So he comes up with this really brilliant idea. He had always been interested in prison reform. And he knew that in America, they were trying out this whole new idea of the penitentiary, where a criminal would go into solitary confinement and would live in a prison and would reflect on his bad deeds and would repent of his evil ways. And so there's all this important prison reform going on. Let's go across the ocean and let's study this. Write a book about it. And then that will help advance my career, and it will also help me get out of France and get away from some of this pressure that I'm under as a result of the overthrow of Charles X. So Tocqueville and Beaumont together, they go and they secure official commissions for the Ministry of Interior in February of 1831, and they departed France on April 2nd of that year. Now, it's no secret that their primary interest, especially Tocqueville's primary interest, was not prison reform. He was interested in that, but his primary interest was to study the Republican example that America was presenting to the world. He wanted to identify lessons derived from the American experience with revolution and then also democracy. I'm going to read to you just a short sentence from his introduction. He said, "I sought there the image of democracy itself, with its inclinations, its character, its prejudices, its passions, in order to learn what we Frenchmen have to fear or to hope from its progress." So that's what his goal is. He believes that democracy is a world movement that's being, advanced by the hand of God himself. And so what can we learn from this movement? Can we control the movement? Can we secure liberty in the midst of this movement? And he said he wanted to find out if there were means of rendering democracy profitable to mankind. Now, what was America like in 1831? What did he come and see when he got here? Well, he arrives on May 9th, 1831, and he's in America, traveling around until February 20th, 1832, when he departs America for France. Andrew Jackson was finishing his very first term, and of course he would go on to win re-election in 1832 and serve his second term. Indian removal was underway under President Jackson. So between 1830 and 1838, what they called the 5 civilized tribes, the Seminoles, the Cherokees, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws. Who did I miss? The Creeks, thank you very much, were relocated to today's Oklahoma. Of course, you know about the Trail of Tears. So that was going on while Beaumont and Tocqueville were in America. Also, the Nat Turner Slave Rebellion took place in 1831 in Virginia. This was the largest slave rebellion in the United States, in North America in history, surpassed only by the slave revolt in Haiti 30 years or so before. Also, the Nullification Crisis was in a lull period. There was a burst of this in 1828, and then it reappeared again later in 1832. But Tocqueville writes about the Nullification controversy, and he reflects on that. This is what America looked like in 1830. Boundaries of the United States were, of course, very different in 1830 than they are today. And if you just look at this map here, there's a few things I want you to notice. The Louisiana Purchase that had occurred in 1803 most of it is in light blue. You see that Oregon country is in a little bit darker blue. That's because the United States and Great Britain were sharing Oregon country. And so the boundary between British North America, which is today Canada, is at the 49th parallel up until the Oregon country. And the boundary of Oregon country is now a present-day boundary of British Columbia. But the United States and the British hold joint occupancy of Oregon until 1846. So quite a long time after Tocqueville's visit. Also, you'll notice in yellow that all the territory from Texas to the Pacific is still held by Mexico. The United States would conquer that territory from the Mexicans in 1848 in the Mexican War. But as yet, it's still not part of American territory. Also notice that you see red states and green states. So the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Missouri comes in as a slave state. Maine comes in as a free state, making America literally half slave and half free, as Abraham Lincoln famously described America in 1858. And so slavery was becoming a very divisive issue in the United States during this time. This is a map from 1860 showing the concentration of slaves in the South, in the southern slave states. So if you notice, the greatest concentration of slaves is along the Mississippi River, Mississippi River Valley, and then in South Carolina and also in Tidewater, Virginia. Well, it's interesting. When Tocqueville and Beaumont were traveling through America, they actually came down the Mississippi River all the way down to New Orleans. So they traveled through the country that has the most slaves of anywhere else in the South. And then they proceeded on through central Alabama, central Georgia, central South Carolina, Fayetteville, North Carolina, Richmond, all the way to Washington, D.C. So they followed the belt where there was the most concentration of slaves. And Tocqueville writes a great deal about slavery and racial prejudice in Democracy in America. Beaumont wrote a book studying slavery and race prejudice all its own. It's actually a novel called Marie, or Slavery in the United States. And it's a very moving read. It's actually not even translated until 1958. But it's actually meant to be, according to James Schliefer, a Tocqueville scholar, it's actually meant to be read as a companion piece to Tocqueville's work. But nevertheless, slavery is a very divisive issue in 1831, and with Nat Turner's rebellion, with William Lloyd Garrison starting his journal called The Liberator, the abolitionist movement is really going to get underway in 1831. And then, of course, let's not forget that the United States possessed a very religious culture back in those days, much more so than we're used to today. The Second Great Awakening is underway. And so Christianity is being really democratized during this period of time. And you have the Methodists are exploding, and the Baptists are exploding. They're spreading out all over the country, as well as several other evangelical groups. And you also have the growth of what Tocqueville called voluntary associations. Associations like the American Bible Society, which is founded in 1816 and has as its goal to put a Bible in the hands of every family household in the United States. Also, the American Home Missionary Society, the Sunday School Union, the Temperance Society, the New York Anti-Tobacco Society. various anti-slavery societies, and then there are a host of other local societies. My favorite is this one: the Ladies' Association for the Benefit of Gentlewomen of Good Family, reduced in fortune below the state of comfort to which they have been accustomed. That's actually a real voluntary association. Now, voluntary associations are really important for Tocqueville. He writes about this all the time, and he says that voluntary associations are key to the preservation of liberty in America, because what you have is people in a locale gathering together, solving their own problems and not relying on the national government to do it for them. So you have a decentralization of political and social and economic power, which is really profound, right? So all this historical background is necessary for us if we're going to think historically about Tocqueville's project. He entered and exited a particular moment in American history that is now, of course, long gone. And so what we have to do is we have to consider change over time. The world is very different. America is very different than it was back in the 1830s, 1820s, 1830s. It's very different. We have to think about context, which is what we're doing right now. We have to think deeply about context. We have to think about causality. How did the Second Great Awakening happen? How did slavery get started? These are questions that are worth considering when we read Democracy in America. And also complexity. This is a very complex time in American life. History is very complex. History resists our efforts to simplify it, just as our own day is very complex. I mean, did you see the debate the other night? Our own times are very complex. Where are the easy answers that we're facing as American citizens? Well, there aren't very many. And just as our day is complex, well, their day was complex too. And we can't just simplify. We can't simplify the history of the United States that way. Also, Tocqueville is often regarded as something of a prophet. Because when you read Democracy in America, he's right about so many things. He warns Americans and his audience about things to watch out for in terms of the encroachment of despotism. And it's tempting to read Democracy in America and say, oh, wow, this guy's a prophet. He had a second sense, or he had some kind of a gift, right? Maybe God made him write this book. He's not a prophet. And he didn't think of himself as a prophet. Tocqueville had a very high view of human freedom. He believed that human beings were born free and independent and responsible for their actions and their choices that they make. And so he would resist with every fiber of his being called a prophet for our own day. And so if we consider Tocqueville a prophet, we've missed the whole point of his book. And also the America of the 1830s. It's tempting to kind of look back on this and say, wouldn't it be great to recover this? And certainly we want to say that we want religion to play a much more lively and vital role in our public life. I don't know that anybody in this room would disagree with that. If so, then let's talk afterwards, and I'll try to convert you. But we don't want to recover the past, especially that past, because they were sinners too, and they had social evils in the United States back then as well, just like we do now. We don't want to trade one sin for another sin. So that's what I mean when we have to think historically. We have to think about the historical moment that Tocqueville is placed in. Nostalgic thinking about 19th century America is futile, and it misses the point of the book. Now, finally, how is the book received when it comes out, and why is it useful for today? And this is how we'll close and go to questions. Volume 1, as I said, is published in 1835. Volume 2 comes out in 1840. And one other thing we'll say about historical context, Tocqueville writes from his own personal historical context. His family's experience with the Revolution. His family's experience with the Reign of Terror. The rise and fall of Napoleon. He's born around the same time as the Battle of Austerlitz. Okay. The rise and fall of the Restoration Bourbon monarchy under Charles X. The July Revolution. the rise of Louis Philippe, who Louis Philippe is going to be overthrown in 1848 in the Revolution too. The common denominator in his experience in France is instability. So one of the points of his writing Democracy in America, how do Americans have a revolution that lasts for a very long time and come out of it with stability? How is that possible? And as a Frenchman, having witnessed the things that he has witnessed, this is a profound and deeply meaningful question for him. So we want to remember that when we read this book as well. Volume 1 is received in 1835 as an absolute masterpiece. People say he's like the second coming of Montesquieu. John Stuart Mill, the famous English philosopher across the channel, loves the book, raves about it. There are really no negative reviews. There's one negative review that appears in an ultra-royalist journal. But everybody receives Volume 1 as a masterpiece. He becomes famous. He becomes something of a celebrity. He enters politics. He's elected to public office. He gets married to celebrate the publication of the first volume. He marries Marie Motley, who is an Englishwoman. And so, he's a very young man. He's only 30 years old when it's published. And he comes into, the world is his oyster. And then Volume 2 comes out in 1840. Volume 2 is received with less enthusiasm because Volume 2 is a little bit more abstract. It's a little more prosaic in its style. It's much more philosophical. But there are some things going on in his personal life, too. He struggled with some health problems. He's starting a family, starting a political career. He's distracted. And he's also losing memory. He's starting to forget things that had happened in 1831 and 1832 as he's writing in the 1837 and 1838. So that sort of accounts, or some of the things that account for the differences between Volume 1 and Volume 2. But nevertheless, when the work is done and it comes out in 1840 and it's translated into English, it is received as the most insightful, the most far-reaching analysis of the United States of its time, and it's still regarded that way. So while we want to think about democracy in America historically, there is still much for us today to learn from it. For example, the way he uses the terms equality, democracy, and liberty. And these are key terms that he uses throughout both Volume 1 and Volume 2. We think of these terms as almost being synonymous. But for Tocqueville, they're not synonymous. So what does he mean by them? Well, for equality, he thinks about equality as being social, economic, and political mobility. In today's culture, we think of equality as being sameness. We want to level the field. We want to bring the poor up and bring the rich down. That is not how Tocqueville defines equality. Instead, he sees it as mobility, because it's the eroding of an ancient hereditary title and privilege that had existed in Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire, right? This doesn't exist in the United States in the same way it existed for generation after generation after generation in Europe. Okay. Also, he refers to how there's a widely shared education among Americans. There are egalitarian ideas about religion and about social relationships. So these are some of the things he means by equality. What about democracy? Well, democracy he uses almost synonymously with equality when he's talking about social activity and social relationships. But of course, democracy he means also, in a political sense, the way we would take it to mean. Sovereignty of the people, a broad suffrage, majority rule, those kinds of things. And then liberty or freedom, and he'll use those two interchangeably. Primarily, he thinks about liberty as a moral liberty, in a moral sense. That all human beings are born free and independent with responsibility for their choices and for their actions. But he also thought of liberty in particular terms. Liberty as an abstraction is meaningless without particular aspects of liberty, like liberty of the press, liberty of religion, liberty of voluntary associations, which he writes about all the time. And liberty, where do these liberties get their energy from? How are they enlivened? Well, they're enlivened by what he calls the manners or mores of the Americans. And this is like the overall character of the population, of the Americans. And what is the source of American manners primarily? Religion, gained out of the churches, right? So religion and a religious life, a very lively religious life that he sees in America, he sees that, the influence of religion, as being critical to the survival and preservation and extension of liberty in the United States. That's something we can learn today. That's something that Washington and our state governments can learn, and primarily our local governments can learn. One last thing about liberty. He always saw liberty as in active terms. He called it, one of the things he called it was a public spirit. He went to New England. He saw the townships in Massachusetts and in Connecticut, and he was really impressed by the New England townships. And he said, there's a public spirit about these people. There is we might call it a virtue or a patriotism about these people. Everybody has a stake in the flourishing of the community, of the town, right? And that's really important. And of course, that too is enlivened and invigorated by religion. But democracy and equality are actually at odds with liberty. It is our tendency, because of our sin and our human nature, to give up our liberty in exchange for equality. Because equality, Tocqueville says, it yields instant gratification, whereas the fruits of liberty are hard-won and take struggle and take patience. And so it is our human nature to prefer equality over liberty. People will trade their liberty for equality. It yields materialism. It yields selfishness, which in turn yields apathy, which in turn yields centralization of government, which in turn leads to what he called democratic despotism. Still live in a democracy, but it's despotic. So Democracy in America offers a program for the preservation of liberty. How can we preserve liberty in the face of the threats that democracy and equality present to it? A very interesting question for Americans today, and it's extremely pertinent today when we think about where we are. So, to close with this, Tocqueville emphasizes that humans are born free. There is no such thing as historical inevitability. It is not inevitable that we are going to lose our liberty when equality is extended. But if we are going to possess liberty, and if we're going to preserve it, then what is required is watchfulness and wisdom and a public spirit. And if we follow his recommendations, we'll be doing well. So, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
All right, thank you, Dr. Wilsey. We have some time for questions and answers. So if you have a question for Dr. Wilsey, please raise your hand. We have an Acton staff member who will make his way with a microphone right down here in the second row.
Dr. Wilsey, today a lot of people think the idea of income inequality or difference is a terrible evil. I wonder if it was even thought about back in Tocqueville's time.
It was certainly thought about in France, certainly in France. And so,
I mean in the United States.
Yeah, in the United States, he is amazed when he goes to New England and does not see class distinctions like he saw and he was used to in France. In New England, especially, I mean, for him, New England is almost it's the creme de la creme of what he experiences. He travels into New England, but then he also travels down the Ohio River and then down south. And so he sees contrasts throughout. And so when he gets to, say, Kentucky, and he sees on one side of the Ohio, he's famous for having said this comparison. On one side of the Ohio, on the Kentucky side, you see indolence. You see the white masters are They don't have a high view of work. They're just lazing around while the slaves are out, by the sweat of their brow, or working and giving the fruits of their labor to somebody else. But on the other side of the Ohio, in the state of Ohio, he says all is busyness, all is activity. Everybody has a stake in their town or their county or their locality. So it's often said that Tocqueville said, well, America is a classless society. He does say that about certain areas, like New England. But he also recognizes that there are class differences, especially in the South, but even in New England, places like Lowell, Massachusetts, where the first textile mill goes up, right? And so this is one of the very first industrial towns, and he sees class distinctions there. And but he doesn't, of course, he doesn't use the term income inequality, but he notices these things. And the danger of it is that if you pursue equality, first of all, it's an unattainable goal. And also, it only leads to selfishness and materialism, which in turn will lead to despotism. Does that? Excellent.
All right, right back here.
You mentioned about a program for the preservation of liberty, and also how religion basically is the basis for the character, according to de Tocqueville. If you were to take that in today's world, and just from your knowledge and experience, what would you say are some things we could do to make that happen?
Well, I really resonate with what Tocqueville says about voluntary associations and local sovereignty. The sovereignty of the people being played out in local towns and local communities. I do think that we give over too much responsibility to our national government. We think that we live in a democracy and we participate in democracy because we're about to vote in a presidential election, right? And most people, the only voting experience they have is, in a national election. But they're unengaged in their local politics because, well, the issues are boring, or they don't really affect me, or as long as the roads are smooth and, their signs are up there, I'm fine, that kind of thing. So I think that if what we need to do as citizens is to look towards our local associations. Now, Tocqueville said that the most important voluntary association were the churches, right? And of course, I certainly agree with that, right?
Right down here on the front row.
Just real quick, was he bilingual? Did he speak English well? Did he speak English fluently? And did he become rich with the sales of the book?
He did. He did become rich from the sale of the book. He was already rich, but he did become rich as a result. He was fluent in English. He wrote very good English. He had a long correspondence while he was in America with friends in England. He married an English woman.
But the books were written in French, though, correct?
It's written in French. It's immediately translated to English by Henry Reeve, who was a friend of his in England. Interestingly enough, Tocqueville and Beaumont produce a book on the prisons in the United States. They do that first. And they win a very prestigious award. And they win a cash prize. And the cash prize helped fund their trip, helped pay the debts from their trip. Because the French government did not pay for their trip. So that's one of the things that just blows me away. These guys were prodigies. Yeah. So yes.
I've wondered, there's a hospital system in Detroit area, Beaumont Hospital, and I've seen some records that de Tocqueville had gotten up to Mackinac Island, where
That's
there's an infamous surgeon, did some experimental work on a French-American trader.
That's right.
And his traveling partner was Beaumont. So I wonder, is there a connection between the Dr. Beaumont and his traveling associate?
That's a good question.
Visiting Mackinac Island.
I don't know the answer. Where is this? Where's
Northern Michigan, very tip between the
Yes,
lower
well,
peninsula and
they
upper.
they sort of made a last-minute decision to travel into the frontier. They wanted to see the frontier, Who wouldn't, sort of, right? Maybe some of you wouldn't, but they do. They take a steamship and they go up I'm
Lake
sorry.
Huron.
I live in Texas, so Lake Erie.
Lake Huron. And there's
And
some
so-
records of them visiting Mackinac Island, which is a popular tourist destination.
And I wouldn't be surprised if it's named after Beaumont because, yeah, they spent 2 weeks. And Tocqueville wrote a little piece about it called A Fortnight in the Wilderness.
Yeah.
It's very interesting reading, too. Yeah.
All right, Patrick, we've got a question right over here.
Thank you for a great lecture.
Thank you.
Can you elaborate on the antagonism between government and voluntary associations that Tocqueville saw? It seems as if you're saying that that through voluntary associations, individuals are sort of able to stand up to the government. Does this mean that the government is antagonistic to voluntary associations? What do you say about that?
In the 1830s, the federal government has a very ambivalent role towards local or locales. They don't see it as their jurisdiction. They don't, and which it's not. They left state government to the states. Even Andrew Jackson, who was seen as something of a tyrant by his enemies, he was called King Andrew I, right? He still, he recognized that there were great limits to what the federal government could do. And of course, the Civil War is what changes the relationship between the federal government and the state. So we're talking about 30 years before the war. And so this federal government is very small. It has a very small bureaucracy, if you even want to call it that. So Tocqueville does not observe that local associations are antagonistic to the federal government. Quite the opposite. He talks about how Americans have a patriotism and a loyalty to their federal government that exceeds anything he's ever seen anywhere he's ever been, even in France and England. He talks about patriotism as being a religion of the Americans, all of its own. And buy my book on American exceptionalism, and you can read some more about that. So it's a little bit different. It's not, we see a lot more of that in our day to day, but back in those days there wasn't that antagonism yet. There will be in 1861. But even that will be more between state and federal, not so much between local or church and government. Remember that the federal government, the First Amendment, federal government has no, Congress shall make no law, respecting the establishment of religion or inhibiting the free exercise thereof. And that's only, that's a statement limited only to the federal government. It doesn't apply to the states. Massachusetts has an established church when Tocqueville visits. It's disestablished in 1833, as you probably know. But anyways, I'm kind of rambling now, so I hope I answered your question. Yeah.
Professor, thank you for your comments. I found them very interesting. I'd like to understand more, was Tocqueville's book, which was obviously very successful, especially the first volume when published,
Right.
did it have an impact on the development of French society and the trajectory of how it was developing, or was it just an interesting read and kind of disappeared from the European side?
No, it has a huge impact because it's received so enthusiastically. It has a great impact. It's a little bit harder to discern because you still have a great deal of instability in France, particularly with the Revolution of 1848 and the rise of Napoleon III. And so it's a little bit difficult to discern it from our perspective here as Americans, because their society is just it's their experience with revolution is so different than our own. So I'm not sure I can go much deeper than that to answer your question, but that is a great question, though.
Tocqueville comes to America during Andrew Jackson's presidency, and you probably would say Jackson is the first president who is not of the American aristocracy, I would guess, in a
That's
way.
right.
And so is there some sense that he's coming at a time when this looks like it will survive, even though it's a common person raising up to being raised up to rule.
No, that's a great point. And you know, one of the things that's so interesting that we don't see much in his book, you see it more in his diaries, in his letters. He meets with all of the major personalities in American history in that time. He meets with John Quincy Adams, and they discuss slavery in French. He meets with Sam Houston before Sam Houston was Sam Houston, right? And they talked about the Indians because Sam Houston was a great friend to the Indians. He talks with Andrew Jackson. He meets with him in the White House. He meets with Charles Carroll, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was the last surviving signer of the Declaration of Independence from Maryland. He meets with him. He meets with, I mean, you name it. If it's an important figure of the day, he probably met with him and had dinner with him. Some of them he met with more than once. So he writes about Jackson in Democracy in America, particularly in the last chapter of Volume 1, the chapter on race. He writes about Jackson. He writes about Jackson concerning nullification. He writes about Calhoun and their feud that they had. So that, what you're saying, is not lost on Tocqueville by any stretch. It's a great point.
Any discernible connection between the publishing of the book and immigration patterns in the time following?
That's a great question. He does talk about the differences in stock as you go west and south. He also does talk about one of the things that he does that's a little bit overlooked. After they went into the frontier into Michigan, they took a steamship back through the Great Lakes and up the St. Lawrence Seaway, and they go to Quebec, and they spend time in French Canada among their countrymen in America. And in his letters and in his diary journal entries, he writes a great deal about that. He wanted to go to see his countrymen in New France. He wanted to see what their conditions were like. But in terms of commenting on, say, the Scotch Irish in the Appalachian Mountains, or the Scotch Presbyterians, or the Dutch in New York, or something like that, he doesn't spend a great deal of analysis on that.
I'm fascinated by the whole business of associations, because one of the things that strikes me is that we could use some of that kind of thing in what we do with peace treaties, for instance. One of the first things that the dictators do is take away and hack away at civil society.
Yeah.
Saddam Hussein had the Air Force responsible for baseball. And, one of the things that seems to me that we don't do when we deal with peacekeeping is to insist that the reconstruction of civil society be a very important part of that.
Agreed.
Patrick, we have time maybe for one more question right down here in the front.
About 15 years ago, maybe a little bit more, probably you were too young.
Thank you.
C-SPAN had a series on Tocqueville in America, and it was called Democracy in America, and they highlighted his book. And I wondered if by any chance you saw it. I did see it. And,
I have not seen that.
that's where I got my book.
Oh, beautiful. That's where you got your Pearson book, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I haven't read it yet, which is why I'm here today. But
Wonderful. You will really be absorbed in it. It's a great book.
well, then I'll put in a plug for C-SPAN because they have a great video library.
It's great.
And
Yeah, I need to
you
check
can-
that out. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Very helpful.
I think we can probably take one more, right?
Yeah, you mentioned the pursuit of equality leading to despotism and selfishness.
Yeah.
And I'm curious as your reaction to what progressive liberals seem to think, that free enterprise or capitalism leading to the accumulation of wealth breeds selfishness and individualism, that kind of thing. And so which is kind of, they seem to be counterintuitive, those two principles.
Well, as a historian, I can gracefully back out of a question like that. That's kind of a joke. That was meant to be. Sorry. You know, one thing that sort of, I mean, I will say this about that point that you're making. One thing that's really interesting to me as I read Tocqueville, he has this high view of providence. He thinks that what he calls equality of conditions, the erasure of hereditary privilege and feudalism and aristocracy, and being supplanted by democracy, that is the will of God, that is providence, and he traces in the introduction, he traces a history of that going back to the Middle Ages, right? And he says, and he situates where France is, and where England is, and where the United States is, in that world movement that's being superintended by God himself. Well, Marx had similar views. Now, he's an atheist, of course, and he's a materialist, and he doesn't believe in spirituality, but he's still drawing from Hegel in German idealism. He believes that there is inexorable economic forces that are driving the world to communism inevitably. And he calls himself a prophet. He's not like Tocqueville, you know. He doesn't believe in human freedom at all. He's a determinist. But there's something similar, right? There's a similar kind of a worldview, of a metaphysic, if you will, even though Marx is a materialist. And I think that's maybe a little bit related to what you're saying. When you compare, you know, liberals, progressives today, and talk about the evils of capitalism, I think, as I reflect on it, I think says more about the human condition of sin than it does about anything else. That we want what we want, and we will justify it any way we can.
All right. Thank you very much, Dr. Wilsey.
Thank you so
and
much.
thank you
Appreciate
for
it.
your attention.